The courtroom in Maplewood, Georgia, was silent, thick with tension, as Judge Arthur Whitmore adjusted his glasses and peered down at the defendant. The entire town had been watching the case unfold, a high-profile robbery turned violent, and now it was time for justice to be served. Or so he believed. "Mr. Michael Graves," Whitmore began, his voice a measured, authoritative rumble. "You stand convicted by a jury of your peers for the armed robbery of Crenshaw and Company, Bank, an incident that left a security guard in critical condition. Your actions were not only reckless but showed blatant disregard for the law." Michael Graves, a 29-year-old father one, stood at the defense table. His hands were shackled, his face pale but determined. He had pleaded his innocence from the moment of his arrest, but no one had listened. Not the jury, not the prosecutor, and certainly not Judge Whitmore. "I am bound to uphold the law, not sentimentality," Whitmore continued, his expression as unyielding as the stone walls of the courthouse. "For these crimes, I hereby sentence you to 30 years in state prison." The gavel struck like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through courtroom. In the back row, Michael's wife Rachel choked back a sob, gripping their young son's hand as tears slid down her cheeks. Michael himself barely reacted. He had known this moment was coming. What did innocence matter when the system had already decided his fate? As officers led him away, Judge Whitmore exhaled heavily. He had done his job. Justice had been served. Or so he thought. Little did he know, the case was far from closed, and what he was about to uncover would unravel everything he thought he knew. Judge Arthur Whitmore returned to his chambers, the weight of the sentencing pressing down on him. The courtroom was still abuzz with murmurs outside, but he shut the door, drowning out the noise. He poured himself a glass of water, staring at his reflection in the framed certificate hanging on the wall. 30 years. He had handed out countless sentences in his career, but something about this one gnawed at him. Michael Graves had not begged for mercy. He had not wept or cursed the system. He had stood there, looking directly at the judge, his steady gaze seeming to ask, "Why won't you see the truth?" Whitmore shook the thought away. The evidence had been clear. Surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and the weapon found with Michael's fingerprints. But something lingered, a whisper of doubt in the back of his mind. He brushed it aside. It was just another case. That night, as he sat in his study, he picked up a new case file from his desk. A recent internal affairs report regarding police misconduct had landed in his hands. He scanned the document absent-mindedly until a name made him freeze. Detective Brian Adler. Whitmore leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Adler had been the lead investigator in Michael Graves' case, the same detective responsible for securing the evidence, obtaining witness statements, and linking Graves to the crime. That Adler's name was all over this misconduct report. Allegations of evidence tampering, coercion of witnesses, and even planting evidence in previous cases. That a wave of unease crashed over Whitmore. He turned back to Graves' case file, flipping to the pages with growing sense of urgency. If Adler had falsified evidence before, was it possible he had done the same to Michael Graves? His hands tightened around the papers. He needed answers. The next morning, Whitmore arrived at his office before dawn. He called for his clerk and requested full access to the evidence logs and police reports from the Graves case. Hours later, he sat alone in his office. Sifting through stacks of documents, a troubling pattern emerged. The gun, allegedly found in Michael Graves' apartment, had an unusual chain of custody. It had been confiscated during an unrelated crime just 3 days before the bank robbery, yet had somehow reappeared as the key piece of evidence against Graves. Even more disturbing was the anonymous tip that led to Graves' arrest. The phone number that had made the call was linked to a burner phone, and after pulling some strings, Whitmore received records showing that the burner phone had been purchased using Detective Adler's personal credit card. Whitmore felt sick. This wasn't negligence. This was deliberate. Michael Graves had been framed. Whitmore sat in stunned silence. "I sentence an innocent man to 30 years in prison and a man with a son. A man whose wife had begged for mercy. He had destroyed a family based on lies." For the first time in his long career, Judge Whitmore felt something foreign in his chest. Guilt. And for the first time, he knew he had to set things right. Whitmore moved swiftly. He couldn't risk alerting Adler or anyone involved in corruption. He arranged a private meeting with the district attorney, presenting everything he had uncovered. The DA, initially skeptical, turned pale as he read the documents. This is enough to reopen the case, the DA murmured, shaking his head. But this goes deeper than Graves. If Adler planted evidence here, how many other convictions are compromised? The realization sent a chill through Whitmore. If Adler had done this once, he had done it before. They filed an emergency motion to review Graves' case. But Whitmore knew paperwork wouldn't be enough. If he wanted to dismantle the corruption within the justice system, he needed to make a statement. And so, he did something he had never done before. He visited Michael Graves in prison. The prison was cold and uninviting, the fluorescent lights buzzing above Whitmore's head as he walked down the hallway. He had spent years sentencing men to these walls, but he had never stepped inside himself. Michael Graves sat on the other side of the glass partition, his expression unreadable. "You," Graves said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Whitmore hesitated for only a second before saying the words he never thought he would utter. "I made a mistake." Graves stared at him, then let out a humorless laugh. "A mistake? You sentenced me to 30 years. My son barely knows me anymore. My wife—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. "Now you want to tell me it was a mistake?" "Yes," Whitmore admitted, his voice heavy with regret, "and I'm going to fix it." Graves scoffed. "How? The system already decided I'm guilty. What judge is going to overturn it?" Whitmore took a deep breath. "I am." Graves' eyes widened. He studied Whitmore, searching for deception, but found none. Whitmore wasn't there for redemption. He wasn't there for forgiveness. He was there to deliver true justice. And for the first time in years, Graves allowed himself a glimmer of hope. The retrial was swift. With the new evidence presented, the conviction was overturned. Michael Graves was released, a free man once more. But the story didn't end there. Detective Adler was arrested for misconduct, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Further investigations revealed that at least a dozen other convictions had been tainted by his actions. The justice system had been exposed for what it was, a fragile structure built on trust, one that had been exploited by corruption. Judge Whitmore didn't step down from a bench. Instead, he dedicated the rest of his career to ensuring no other innocent person suffered the way Michael Graves had. In Graves, he reunited with his wife and son, but the scars of his wrongful imprisonment lingered. When the settlement money from a lawsuit came in, he used it to open a small repair shop, the dream he had spoken of before his conviction. Life moved forward, but Judge Whitmore would never forget the day he almost let an innocent man disappear into the system that IT was a mistake he would never make again.